The sun was gone for more than a year. There was no summer. That was in the 6th century. That one strange year. But it was just the start. A hidden force was reshaping the ancient world. The climate was shifting in late antiquity. A silent revolution in the sky. It may have sped up the collapse of empires. You'll see history differently by the end. Volcanoes and weather patterns become as important as emperors and armies. The Roman Empire was mighty, its rivals too. They were fighting invaders, but they were also fighting their own environment. The environment that sustained them. What does a civilization's fate really depend on? The world was connected, from Britain all the way to the Persian Gulf. Roads and rivers and this shared ambition, they tied everything together. This was late antiquity. You had the Roman Empire, this huge thing, split into a western half and an eastern half. It was a pillar of the known world, and to its east was its rival, the Sasanian Persian Empire, a sophisticated place full of cities, poets, powerful cavalry. And beyond them, the vast steppes. Nomadic confederations lived there. Their movements were as unpredictable as the weather. These weren't isolated kingdoms. They were nodes, points in a sprawling network. Roman grain from Egypt fed cities in Italy. Persian silk moved west along caravan routes. Soldiers and merchants guarded those routes. Ideas flowed on them, faiths, gold, the whole system. It depended on this delicate agreement with nature. An unspoken one. Fields needed predictable rain. Mountain passes had to stay clear. Harvests had to be abundant, reliable, year after year to feed the millions in crowded cities like Rome, Constantinople, Ctesiphon. It was a tapestry, a staggeringly complex one, but its threads were fragile. A single, powerful pull in one corner could unravel stability somewhere else. Thousands of miles away, the empires, they thought their biggest threats were armies, political betrayal. They didn't realize their most formidable challenge was brewing in the atmosphere itself. A silent stressor about to test the very foundations of their interconnected world. We know it as the Late Antique Little Ice Age, a global cooling that started around 536 and lasted until about 660. This wasn't just a bad winter, it was a new climate, a deep, persistent chill across the northern hemisphere for over a century, but the evidence, we don't have weather records from then. No thermometers, the evidence is in the Earth's own archives, natural records. Scientists use proxies for that, indirect measures. One proxy is the ice. From glaciers in Greenland, Antarctica, researchers drill out long cylinders of ancient ice. Each layer is a year's snowfall, a time capsule. Inside are tiny bubbles of ancient air. And dust particles, chemicals that fell from the sky. Analyzing these layers gives a climate history. They look for sulfate spikes, the chemical fingerprint of a massive volcanic eruption. A volcano with enough force can blast sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. It forms a reflective veil of aerosols. That veil spreads around the globe. It blocks sunlight, scatters the rays back into space. The result is sudden, dramatic cooling. The ice cores show the mid-6th century had some of the most severe volcanic events in 2,000 years. Another proxy is the trees. The science is dendrochronology, reading tree rings. Each year, a tree adds a new growth ring. In a good year with sun and rain, the ring is wide. In a bad year, a cold year, a drought, the ring is narrow. By studying ancient timber from logs to archaeological sites, scientists build a calendar of climate stress. The tree rings from the mid-530s, they're not just narrow, they are among the narrowest ever recorded. They speak of years when growth nearly stopped. When summer never really came, lake beds and ocean sediments add to this. They preserve pollen and plankton that shift with the temperature. Bring these proxies together: the ice, the trees, the mud, and a clear image emerges. The late antique world was hit by a climatic catastrophe, a series of volcanic winters so severe they triggered a long-term cooling phase. That was the engine of the late antique Little Ice Age. A physical reality with a chemical signature written in ice and wood. But then this new, colder world meets the complex, interconnected empires we talked about. The answer is a cascade of consequences, starting with the most fundamental resource. The year 536 started with a sun that didn't shine. It was a darkness you could feel. A chronicler in Constantinople wrote that the sun gave its light without brightness, like the moon, for a whole year. And you see the same reports from the Byzantine Empire all the way to China. A strange gloom settled over the land. Frost whitened fields in midsummer. Snow fell where it never should. The world grew cold and the light grew dim. This was the dust veil event. It's a mystery that shows up in records across continents. For over a year, the daylight stayed weak and eerie. Crops failed, not from drought, but from this deep, unnatural chill. Imagine that fear, a society's entire rhythm, its planting and harvest, its sense of time, thrown off by a sky that wouldn't behave. This wasn't a local storm. It was a planetary event. The main explanation now is a titanic volcanic eruption, one of the most powerful in thousands of years. Which volcano is still debated. Some evidence points to Ilopango in Central America. Other clues suggest an eruption in the far north, maybe Alaska or Iceland. But the location matters less than the scale of the impact. What matters is the physics. A volcano that big doesn't just spew lava. It can blast millions of tons of fine ash and, more crucially, sulfate aerosols high into the stratosphere miles above the weather. Up there, these particles form a thin, reflective veil. They drift on the winds and encircle the globe. This veil acts like a mirror, scattering sunlight back into space. It doesn't block all light, but it filters it, weakens it, creating that pale, moon-like sun people described. And more critically, it reduces the solar energy reaching the Earth's surface. The result is a rapid, dramatic cooling, a volcanic winter. This wasn't just one bad season. It was the trigger. The 536 event was the opening shock of what's called the Late Antique Little Ice Age. It delivered a sudden, violent blow to the delicate agricultural systems that fed empires. A year without a proper summer meant no harvest. No harvest meant empty granaries. Empty granaries meant hunger and rising prices and a populace suddenly vulnerable. The empires of Rome and Persia were built on logistical genius, on moving grain from fertile provinces to dense cities. But their whole system was based on a stable climate delivering predictable yields. The dust veil shattered that assumption in a single, terrifying year. The chronicles talk about the strange sky and the cold, but that's just the first chapter. The real story is what happened next, in the years and decades after, as this initial shock reverberated through every layer of society. The cold didn't just vanish after a year. It lingered and it deepened, setting the stage for a century of profound change. How does a civilization, already straining under its own complexity, respond when the very environment it depends on becomes an adversary? That single year of darkness was just the start. The volcanic winter in 536 was the first brutal hit, but the climate wasn't done. Just as people were trying to get back up, the sky delivered another blow. And then another one. The evidence from ice cores and tree rings shows two more massive eruptions, one around 540, another around 547. These weren't aftershocks, they were new, major events, each one throwing another layer of sun-blocking particles into an atmosphere that was already stressed. It was like a series of hammer blows on one fragile point. The world hadn't even warmed back to normal from the first eruption when the second one struck. The cooling didn't just reset, it compounded. That created what some researchers call a decade without a summer. Not literally, but a period where cool, short-growing seasons became the grim new normal. For farmers across Europe, the Mediterranean, the Near East, this was an existential crisis. One failed harvest, you could survive by using grain reserves. Two in a row, that meant severe hardship, skyrocketing prices. But 3, 4, 5 years straight of stunted growth, that was a catastrophe no one alive had seen before. The cumulative impact on agriculture, the absolute bedrock of every ancient empire, is almost impossible to overstate. Fields that normally produced bounty yielded little. Vineyards struggled. Olive trees, which take years to mature, might have been killed by the persistent frost. This wasn't just a food shortage. It was the systematic failure of the primary economic engine. Take the Roman state. It functioned by collecting taxes in grain, then redistributing it to feed the army and the cities Constantinople, others. Its entire administrative system was built on moving surplus from fertile regions like Egypt to places that needed it. But what happens when there is no surplus, when every province is struggling just to feed itself? Those logistical systems, marvels of their age, began to groan under a strain they were never designed to handle. The government would have to buy what little grain existed on the open market, draining treasuries of gold. Prices for staple foods would have spiraled beyond what ordinary people could pay. You see hints of this in the record from that time, mentions of famine, strange weather, desperation. The economic foundation was cracking, and when people are hungry and cold and afraid, the social contract that holds a complex society together starts to fray. The empires were now fighting a war on two fronts, against the human pressures at their borders and against the silent, atmospheric pressure withering their fields from within. The breaking point wasn't a single battle. It was a slow, grinding collapse of resilience. So what did that look like on the ground for the millions who lived through it? The bread lines in Constantinople kept getting longer, more desperate. In the Roman East, these were the most advanced cities of their time, and the fundamental contract was breaking. The emperor's most sacred duty was to keep the people fed, to ensure the grain supply. When that failed, everything else began to unravel. The historian Procopius was living through these years. He wrote about the misery. He described a city gripped by scarcity where the price of bread became impossibly high. He tells of riots in the streets. A populace driven to the edge by hunger. This wasn't just a bad season. It was the systemic collapse of agriculture across the empire and the social trauma that followed. The science explains why a cooling climate of just 1 or 2 degrees sustained over years has a devastating effect on farming. It shortens the growing season. Crops like wheat and barley, they need a certain number of warm, frost-free days to mature. When spring comes late and autumn arrives early, that window slams shut. The grain doesn't have time to fully develop, yields plummet, and the cold, damp conditions that came with this little ice age created another invisible enemy. They were a perfect breeding ground for crop blights, for fungal diseases that could wipe out entire fields. The farmers would have watched helplessly as their harvest turned to blackened, rotted stalks. The empire's bread baskets from Anatolia to North Africa were falling silent. The consequences radiated out from the empty field. First came malnutrition. A population chronically short of calories is a weakened population. Their immune systems are compromised. They become far more susceptible to whatever illness passes through. This created what historians call a mortality crisis, a terrible synergy where famine paved the way for epidemic disease to claim even more lives. The body's defenses, already starved, had little left to fight with. But the second consequence was perhaps even more dangerous to the state itself. It was a crisis of legitimacy. For centuries, the Roman social order rested on a simple idea. The emperor and the administration provided security, and most importantly, bread. The dole, the organized grain shipments, were a tangible symbol of that promise. When the granaries stood empty year after year, despite the taxes still being collected, that promise was broken. People didn't blame the weather patterns. They blamed their rulers. The riots Procopius witnessed were more than outbursts of hunger. They were a profound loss of faith. An emperor who could not feed his people was an emperor who had failed in his most basic role. This erosion of trust invited instability. It made people less willing to pay taxes for a state that couldn't protect them. It made soldiers who also needed to eat question their loyalty. The empire's authority was being hollowed out from within, not by barbarian swords but by empty stomachs and by the cold winds that kept the wheat from growing. This agricultural collapse set the stage for the next wave of crisis, an even more devastating one that would travel along the very trade routes that once brought prosperity. It was the empty stomachs, the weakened bodies, that's what made the ground so fertile. In 541, a new horror showed up in Pelusium. That was a busy port right at the edge of Roman Egypt. And it came on the grain ships, the same trade that was supposed to keep people alive. This was the Justinianic plague, the first time we see bubonic plague in the historical record. The bacterium Yersinia pestis, it found a world that was ready. It wasn't the cold climate that caused it, but the years of famine, the social breakdown, they set the stage. A population already malnourished, their immune systems compromised, they had almost no defense, and people were displaced, crowding into cities looking for food. That created dense populations where the disease could spread like wildfire. The climate crisis had primed the empire for a biological catastrophe. The plague moved fast along the same networks that once carried silk and spices. The Roman roads, the sea lanes, those marvels of connectivity, they became highways for death. From Egypt, it went north to Palestine, then to the capital itself, Constantinople, by 542. Procopius saw the famine. Now he described a new despair. He wrote about sudden, violent fevers, dark, painful swellings in the groin or armpits. The speed was shocking. You could feel fine in the morning, be gone by evening. The death toll in the cities was staggering. Some modern estimates in urban centers, maybe a quarter to half the population lost in those initial waves. The empire's machinery seized up the scale of that loss. It wasn't just a number. It was the baker, the soldier, the farmer, the tax collector, the mother, the artisan. A generation of knowledge and labor vanished. The tax base collapsed overnight. Who was left to pay, to fund the army, the bureaucracy? Military recruitment became nearly impossible. Young men dying in their barracks, in their villages. But the most devastating long-term blow was to agriculture. The farms were already struggling with shorter growing seasons. Now they faced a crippling labor shortage. Who was left to plow the fields, to tend the vines, to harvest the grain? Fields that fed millions went fallow. They reverted to wilderness, and that created a cycle. Less farming meant less food, which meant continued vulnerability to disease, further population decline. The plague intersected with the ongoing climatic stress. It created what historians call a multi-front crisis. The empire was being attacked from every direction. From above by a cold sun that wouldn't warm the earth, from within by a microscopic pathogen, and from without by human enemies who sensed weakness. The state's capacity to respond was overwhelmed. Its treasury was drained by famine relief. Its armies were depleted. Its grip on the provinces grew slack. That resilience, the kind that let Rome bounce back before, it was gone, eroded by years of compound shocks. The world of late antiquity was crossing a threshold. The old pillars of order were cracking, and in that instability, new forces were gathering, waiting to reshape the map entirely. The empire's gold was running out. The granaries were empty, and the cost of war was constant. So the Roman treasury made a decision. They started reducing the silver in their coins, the denarius. At first it was subtle. just a little less precious metal mixed in. But over the decades during the crisis, the debasement got severe. A coin that had been trusted everywhere from Britain to Babylon became a pale imitation. It was a hidden tax, a desperate move to stretch what they had left, but it broke something more valuable than silver. It broke trust. Think of a merchant in a port city. A shipment of Egyptian grain comes in, but the price has tripled because the harvest failed. You pay with these new, lighter coins. The seller takes them. He examines them, feels the weight, he frowns. He knows they're worth less than last year's coins. So next time, he raises his prices even higher to make up for it. That cycle is inflation. The value of the money itself is evaporating. Long-distance trade, which was the lifeblood of the empire, became a gamble. Contracts were harder to enforce when the currency wasn't stable. That complex, cash-based economy that fed the cities and paid the soldiers, it began to seize up. The state's response to the crisis was poisoning the very system it was trying to save. But while the central government was floundering, something else was happening in the countryside. The great landowners, the aristocrats with huge estates, were in a stronger position. They weren't as tied to imperial salaries or long supply chains. When trade broke down and coins became suspect, they could rely on the land itself. Their estates turned more self-sufficient. They produced what they needed locally. They offered protection and basic subsistence to desperate farmers in exchange for labor, binding people to the land in new ways. That shift was profound. Power and economic activity were pulling away from the cities, from the imperial center, retreating behind the walls of fortified villas. The integrated imperial market, that masterpiece of Roman logistics, was breaking apart into a patchwork of local economies. The fiscal decay had a direct military consequence. An army is the most expensive tool an empire has. Soldiers expect regular pay in reliable currency. When the state paid them with debased coin, their loyalty was tested. When it couldn't pay them at all, their allegiance vanished. The government's ability to project power, to reinforce distant frontiers, it withered away. Legions that were once paid in solid silver were now grumbling over copper coins washed with a thin silver glaze. That vulnerability didn't go unnoticed. Beyond the frontiers, in the steppes and the forests, rival powers and nomadic groups were watching. They saw the weakened borders, the distracted armies, the internal strife. The economic shockwaves from climate and plague had already cracked the door open, and now a new force was getting ready to push it all the way in. The steppe is this sea of grass. It runs from China all the way to Europe, and for the people who lived there, the Huns, the Avars, later the Bulgars and Magyars, that grassland was their world. Their wealth was in their herds, their horses, and their survival depended on the grass. The grass needed a balance, a certain amount of rain, a certain warmth. Then the late antique little ice age came. It got cooler, drier, that balance broke. The grasslands, they became less productive. Pastures shrank, pastures that used to support vast herds of sheep, goats, horses. For a pastoral society, that's a direct threat. Bad grass means hungry animals, weaker livestock, a community pushed right to the edge. This wasn't sudden. It was a slow pressure, a grinding pressure building over years until it becomes a force. Think of a vise slowly tightening. On one side, environmental stress. The land can't carry as much. On the other side, population, families, clans, tribes that need to move, need to find resources. Their solution was mobility. A solution honed over centuries. When your home can't support you, you move. And when you move, you encounter your neighbors. That starts a chain. One group, displaced by hunger, pushes into another's territory. That second group is displaced now. They have to move. It's a domino effect, a migration radiating outward from the stressed heart of the continent. The Huns moving west, that might have been the first ripple. Pushing the Goths before them, the Vandals, the Alans, these weren't always armies with a plan. Often they were whole peoples on the move, desperate for stable land. For pasture, for a place where the grass grew green again, and that wave it finally crashed against the most visible borders, the Roman limes, those long walls, forts, watchtowers. The edge of the empire, and to the south the Sasanian-Persian frontier, similar defenses. For centuries those borders were manageable, a place for trade. Limited raids, diplomacy, but now the pressure was constant, intensifying, no longer just raiding parties. It was the movement of whole peoples with their families. Their wagons, their herds, they weren't just looking for plunder, they were looking for a home inside the empire's prosperous, still fertile lands that changed everything for Rome and Persia. Frontier defense became the greatest drain on the treasury. The cost: you maintain huge, permanent armies along thousands of miles of border. You pay those soldiers. Clothe them, feed them, you constantly repair the fortifications. You engage in endless diplomacy, paying tribute to some groups to keep them quiet while fighting others. Every ounce of gold that went to the frontier was gold not spent inside. It was grain not sent to the cities, money not used for aqueducts, for public buildings. It was military units pulled from one troubled province to plug a hole in the frontier, leaving the interior exposed. The empires were caught in a bind. A terrible bind. They had to respond to the external pressure or be overrun. But every resource sent to the borders left the core more vulnerable to internal crisis. Famine, plague, economic collapse, their capacity was stretched thinner and thinner, like butter scraped over too much bread. This constant drain made recovery impossible. Just as the empire needed to rebuild its farms, its population, it had to turn outward, to face a threat born in part by a changing climate thousands of miles away. The story of collapse isn't just about barbarians at the gate. It's about why the gatekeepers were so exhausted, so depleted, that the gates began to buckle. The Tigris and Euphrates, they were the twin hearts of the Sasanian Empire. For centuries their water had been channeled, a vast network of canals. It turned the dry plains into a green garden. The empire's breadbasket, its survival depended on a rhythm, a predictable one. The snowmelt from the mountains Anatolia, Armenia, it had to arrive each spring, swelling the rivers just in time for planting. The summer heat had to be intense, but not too intense. Then came the late antique Little Ice Age, and it disrupted that rhythm. The cooling meant shifting atmospheric patterns worldwide. For Mesopotamia, the evidence points to greater aridity, less reliable rain, weaker snowpacks perhaps. The rivers became less predictable. A drought there wasn't just a bad harvest, it was an engineering crisis. Those canals needed constant maintenance. Dredging silt, reinforcing banks, that required a massive labor force, a strong central authority to coordinate it. When the climate turned, the system began to decay. If the river flow was too low, the canals at the far ends would run dry, crops withered. If a sudden flood came, it could breach the dikes, wash away villages. This environmental stress became administrative strain. The state's ability to manage its critical infrastructure was being tested, just as its resources were being pulled elsewhere. That pressure from below, from the failing fields, it found expression in social unrest. In the late 5th and 6th centuries, a radical movement swept through. Mazdakism, its leader Mazdak preached a message, sharing wealth and property, criticizing the vast inequalities. His teachings gained traction during periods of hardship. The connection is clear. When irrigation fails and granaries empty, when the poor bear the brunt, a doctrine of communal sharing sounds like a revelation. The Mazdakite movement became a serious internal challenge. It threatened the throne. It forced the Persian kings to divert attention, to use military force to suppress it. The empire was fighting a war within its own soul, a conflict born from the distress of its land, and all this was happening while the empire was locked in its forever war with Rome. The Roman-Persian frontier, a centuries-old contest, a grinding stalemate of raids and sieges. Both empires poured colossal resources into it. For Persia, the cost was staggering. Maintaining the cavalry, the fortresses, the armies, it drained the treasury. The climatic stresses of the 6th century turned this eternal war into an unbearable burden. A kingdom dealing with droughts, canal repairs, religious revolts, it has less resilience. Its armies, drawn from stressed regions, were harder to recruit. Harder to supply. Every campaign, every defense became more costly. The empire's strength was being sapped from multiple directions. This parallel struggle is crucial. It shows the late antique Little Ice Age was not just a Roman story. It was a hemispheric event. Two superpowers at their peak were being hammered by the same climatic anomaly. Rome faced shortened growing seasons and plague. Persia faced droughts and failing irrigation. Both faced fiscal collapse, social fragmentation, military exhaustion. They were weakening each other through their endless wars, while a changing climate weakened them both from within. This simultaneous diminishment of imperial power created a vacuum. And into that vacuum, from the aridifying steppes, from the revitalized deserts, new forces were already stirring. The balance of power across Eurasia was about to be tipped. Not by a single great battle, but by a century of silent, atmospheric pressure. Power went back to the land. The emperor's coin wasn't trusted. His grain ships didn't come. So people looked to the authority they could actually see. The local landowner, the bishop in his cathedral, the garrison commander. These figures became the centers of a broken world. That grand imperial system, meant to run continents from one capital, it was pulling back like a tide, and what it left was a landscape of isolated islands. Self-reliant, this was the great retreat, but not of armies. It was a retreat of trust. The classical city, that beacon, began to dim. Its forums, its public baths, they needed huge upkeep. That was paid for by imperial money and by trade, but trade crumbled. Taxes dried up, the upkeep became impossible. Aqueducts fell apart, grand buildings were taken apart for stone. Populations shrank, Rome itself shrank, people drifted toward the countryside. That civic ideal of shared space and shared duty, it withered. What grew instead was the fortified hilltop. The walled estate. For a farmer, the choice was stark. The distant emperor couldn't guarantee safety from raiders, couldn't deliver bread in a famine. But the local lord could. He had his armed men, he had his walls. The bishop could too. Using the church's lands, its moral authority, he could organize food for his people. Survival meant attaching yourself to one of these centers. You'd work the Lord's land for his protection. You'd look to the church for charity, for solace. This was patronage on a massive scale. Personal loyalty replaced citizenship. Local obligation replaced imperial duty. That fragmentation broke the mechanics of empire. An emperor in Constantinople could issue a command, but who was left to listen? The tax collector couldn't travel safely to a province controlled by a local magnate. A decree to raise troops would be ignored by a commander who needed every man to defend his own territory. The empire's great strength, its unified system, was dissolving into 1,000 pieces. Each piece was focused on its own immediate survival. This turning local, it was both a symptom of the collapse and what made recovery impossible. Think of a shattered vase. You can glue it back together if the pieces are large, if you have the right adhesive, but if the pieces are ground to dust, reassembly is a fantasy. The late antique Little Ice Age, with its famine, plague, economic shock, it didn't just crack the imperial vase, it pulverized it into that fine dust of local loyalties. How do you rebuild a Mediterranean empire when every community's horizon is the next valley, the next fortified manor? Yet inside that breakdown, new forms of community were being forged. People didn't identify first as Romans anymore. They were those protected by a certain lord, part of a particular Christian parish. the universal was giving way to the particular. That shift in human connection, it laid the groundwork for the world that would come out of the ruins, a world not of empires but of kingdoms, not of cities but of castles. The old order wasn't just falling, it was being replaced piece by localized piece by the seeds of something new. An army marches on its stomach. That was true for Rome and Persia. These weren't small bands, they were vast machines, a field army of 40,000 men. That's a common size for a campaign. They needed a staggering amount of food. Every single day, each soldier needed about 3 pounds of grain, so that's 60,000 pounds of wheat or barley or hardtack just for one day's march. Then you have the animals, the cavalry horses, the pack mules, the oxen for the siege engines. A single horse could eat over 20 pounds of fodder a day. Grass, hay, grain, multiply that by thousands. Keeping an army in the field was a masterpiece of planning. It all depended on one assumption, that the provinces along the route could produce a massive surplus. A reliable one, especially in the frontier zones where armies were stationed. The late antique Little Ice Age shattered that. Think of a Roman legion on the Danube. Its job was to patrol, to deter, to respond to raids. For centuries it was supplied by local farms. The fertile lands of Pannonia, Moesia, they grew the grain. But then the growing seasons shortened. Springs came late and wet. Summers turned cool. Harvests failed, not just once but repeatedly. The local surplus vanished. Now the army's food had to come from somewhere else. Maybe Egypt, maybe North Africa. That meant loading grain onto ships, sailing across the Mediterranean. Offloading it, then hauling it hundreds of miles overland on carts. Oxen pulled those carts, and the oxen needed to be fed. The cost exploded, in time and in gold. The risk of a supply convoy being intercepted, or just not arriving in time, that skyrocketed. An army that can't be fed in place becomes immobile. It becomes a liability. Sitting in its fortress, consuming the last reserves of a starving province. This logistical nightmare changed strategy. Grand offensive campaigns to punish invaders or conquer territory, they became almost impossible to sustain. The empire was forced onto the defensive, not just by enemy pressure, by its own empty granaries, but food was only one part. An army also needs healthy soldiers. And here, the changing climate brought a more insidious threat. The cooler, wetter conditions of this period. Paleoclimate research suggests it altered disease landscapes. In Italy, increased rainfall and flooding could have expanded marshy habitats for mosquitoes that might have led to the spread of malaria into regions where it was less common before. Malaria is a debilitating illness, cycles of fever, chills, profound exhaustion. For a soldier in a crowded barracks or marching through a low-lying camp, it was a silent killer. A unit struck by malaria isn't just dealing with losses. It's a force where half the men are shaking with fever, unable to hold a shield, unable to march in formation. Their effectiveness evaporates. Concentrations of troops necessary for defense became concentrations of vulnerability. An army decimated by illness can't mount a watch, can't repair fortifications, can't muster for battle. The combined effect of these pressures, the broken supply chains and the new disease environments, it created a cascade. A frontier garrison, underfed and weakened by sickness, is less likely to spot a raiding party, less able to mount a vigorous pursuit. A minor border incursion, one that might have been swiftly crushed, now becomes a successful raid. And that encourages more. Each small reversal chips away at the perception of imperial power. For centuries, that strength was a psychological fact. Barbarians might raid, but they knew the legions would arrive. Eventually, in overwhelming force, that perception was the first line of defense. When local tribes saw understrength, hungry, sickly soldiers behind crumbling walls, that perception shattered. They saw weakness and they acted upon it. So the border didn't collapse in a single battle. It frayed. It gave way in 100 places at once, because the system designed to hold it, the system of men, grain, and horses, was breaking down from within. The state's monopoly on violence, its very reason for being, was undermined, not by a superior enemy, by a changing sky and the silent bite of a mosquito. When the emperor could no longer guarantee the security he promised, the last threads of loyalty, out there on the distant frontiers, they began to snap. And in that snapping, you hear the sound of an old world coming apart. The sky was judging them. When the cold comes and the crops die and plague is everywhere, people don't think about volcanoes. They look for a reason, for meaning in the suffering, and in the 6th century that meaning was divine. For the Christians in Rome, the Zoroastrians in Persia, for anyone still holding to the old gods, these disasters weren't random. They were a message, a punishment from heaven for a society that had lost its way. And this wasn't just a private thought, it was preached from pulpits. Written into the records, it shaped the policies of states that were already falling apart. You can hear it in Bishop Gregory of Tours, writing in Gaul as Rome faded. He wrote down the famines, the strange weather, the violence, and for him, every event was a lesson. A flood was God's anger on a sinful town. A king's sickness was payback for an unjust war. His history isn't really a political record, it's a sermon, a long warning to repent. That mindset became a lens. It made the chaos make sense. If the problem was sin, then the answer was piety. Not better farming, not smarter grain storage, and that worldview had real consequences. One was a huge shift in resources. In the middle of famine, with treasuries empty, you see a surge in church building. Emperors like Justinian in Constantinople spent fortunes on projects like the Hagia Sophia. This was an act of penance, a bargain with heaven, stone and mosaic to buy divine favor. But the gold and labor that went into those buildings, that was resources needed elsewhere, for fixing aqueducts, for strengthening walls, for paying soldiers on frontiers that were coming apart. The practical needs of the state were sacrificed for the spiritual needs of the soul. Another consequence was the search for someone to blame. If God was angry, someone had to be at fault. And that usually fell on minorities. In the Eastern Roman Empire, religious minorities faced more persecution. Pagans, Jews, Christians seen as heretics, they were pressured, punished, pushed out. The logic was brutal. Maybe their presence, their wrong beliefs, were polluting the community and bringing down this wrath. By purifying the empire, the rulers hoped to win back God's blessing. But those actions just fractured society further, neighbor against neighbor, energy wasted on internal purges when unity was what they needed most, and then the apocalyptic writing flourished. Visions of the end times, of final battles, they resonated with people living through what felt like the end of the world. That focus on an imminent ending could make long-term planning seem pointless. Why rebuild an irrigation system if the world ends next year? Why invest in the next harvest? That shift in thinking, from solving problems here to preparing for the hereafter, it eroded the will to face the actual earthly crises. The Persian response, under Zoroastrian belief, followed a similar pattern. Droughts and military losses were seen as signs of cosmic imbalance, a fight between light and dark. That led to religious reforms, royal rituals of atonement, a tightening of orthodox control. Again, the mental and material resources of the state were channeled into ceremony and theology, trying to fix a disruption in the spiritual order because they believed that's what caused the disruption in the natural order. Facing suffering that made no sense, turning to divine wrath was a human response. It gave a story to the chaos, a sense of agency when people felt powerless, but that powerful narrative also trapped them. It directed their gaze upward, to heaven for salvation, instead of outward, to the fields, the roads, the borders that needed their attention. The crisis was environmental. economic, but the solution they pursued was spiritual, symbolic, that disconnect between the problem and the attempted cure that might be one of the real tragedies of the age. While the leaders prayed for a miracle, the systems holding their world together kept unraveling, one thread at a time. The story isn't one of everything falling apart. You look to the east, the Western Roman Empire broke into kingdoms, but something else stayed. The Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, it didn't just last, it changed. For centuries more, so the West fell apart and the East held on. That answer is in geography and adaptation and just resilience. The same climate shocks hit everywhere, but not the same way. First, the land. The Eastern Empire's heart was different. Gaul and Britain had shorter, wetter growing seasons, but the agricultural core of the East was Egypt. The Nile Valley. Its rhythm wasn't European rain, it was the annual Nile flood, fed by monsoons far south in Ethiopia. That system was insulated from the cooling in the North Atlantic. Egypt kept producing its huge grain surplus every year. That wheat sailed straight to Constantinople. It fed the capital. It stabilized the state's most vital function. The bread dole in Constantinople was strained, but it never fully broke, not like in the West. The East also had the plains of Anatolia, parts of the Near East. These areas faced hardship, but the diversity of food sources gave the eastern state a buffer the West had lost. Then the city. Constantinople itself was a masterpiece of defense. Its massive land walls, built in the 5th century, were the strongest fortification before gunpowder. They made the city an impregnable fortress. Even with plague or armies outside, the capital itself almost never fell. That gave an unshakable center of power, a symbol of continuity that Rome had lost. The city was also a commercial choke point. It controlled trade between the Black Sea and the Aegean. So revenue kept flowing in, even when land taxes faltered. But geography and walls aren't enough. The Eastern Empire adapted its structure. Emperor Justinian, during the plague and fiscal crisis, launched sweeping reform. His codification of Roman law created a clear, unified system. It outlived the empire. More crucially, his administrators streamlined the tax system. They tried to curb corruption, trying to get efficiency from a shrinking economy. Later, in the 7th century, with wars against Persia and then the Arab armies, Emperor Heraclius enacted radical military reforms. He dismantled the old professional armies tied to the frontiers. In their place, he created the theme system. Soldiers were given grants of land in specific districts called themes. In return, they owed military service. This created a self-sustaining, localized defense force. It tied the army to the land it protected. It drastically cut the state's need for cash to pay salaries. It was a brilliant adaptation for a world where gold was scarce and loyalty was local. This contrast is vital. The late antique Little Ice Age wasn't a deterministic death sentence. It was a severe stress test. The Western Roman Empire, with its overstretched frontiers, its reliance on Northern European agriculture, its political fragmentation, failed that test. Its systems shattered. The Eastern Empire, with more resilient breadbaskets, a defensible capital, and leaders willing to reinvent the state, passed it. It was battered, diminished, forever changed, but it survived. The Empire of Constantinople learned to live in the new, colder world. It bent so it wouldn't break. That resilience, though, was about to meet its greatest challenge, a force from the very deserts that the changing climate may have helped reshape. 476. That's the date, the year the boy emperor Romulus Augustulus was deposed, but that was just a formality. The real collapse was a slow bleed, a century of weakness. And that weakness was fed by a sky that wouldn't cooperate. The Western Empire didn't fall from one bad harvest. It fell because harvests kept failing year after year until the system lost the strength to get back up. Think of the empire's lifeline. By the 4th and 5th centuries, Italy couldn't feed itself. Rome couldn't feed itself. They depended on grain ships from North Africa. From the fertile land around Carthage, that African grain was the fuel. For the court, the bureaucracy, what was left of the army, it was the empire's bread. Then, in 439, that lifeline was cut. The Vandals took Carthage, they took the African provinces, they took the fleet, and they took control of the grain. Overnight, the West's main source of food and revenue was in the hands of a rival power. A catastrophic blow, but its impact was multiplied by the climate of the age. Because even before the Vandals took Carthage, Italy and Gaul were already struggling. The growing seasons were shorter, cooler. Local harvests were unreliable. A community might scrape by in a good year, but there was no surplus, no resilience that made the African grain not just important but essential. It was the difference between stability and starvation. So when that supply was severed, the West didn't just lose a province. It entered a state of permanent food insecurity. The price of bread in Rome would have skyrocketed. The government, its treasury already drained by endless wars, now had to buy what little grain it could from elsewhere, or watch its people riot. This chronic vulnerability reshaped everything. The Western emperor, often in Ravenna now, had less and less to offer. He couldn't reliably pay his soldiers because the tax base was shrinking. He couldn't reliably feed them because the grain ships had stopped. So what did a general do, or a provincial governor? Their loyalty to a distant, weakening center became a luxury. They began to make deals for themselves. They negotiated directly with the Germanic tribes settling inside the borders. They used their Roman titles to command mixed armies. They fought for regional power, not for the empire. The state's authority dissolved into 1,000 local arrangements. A general like Odoacer, who deposed Romulus Augustulus, wasn't a foreign conqueror. He was a commander of Roman forces who saw the central government was now a fiction. There was no empire left to serve, so he took control, not to destroy Rome, but because someone had to govern. The Germanic kingdoms that formed the Visigoths in Spain, the Vandals in Africa, the Ostrogoths in Italy, they didn't smash a healthy system. They moved into a power vacuum. They filled a space where Roman administration had been. The fall wasn't a violent explosion. It was a quiet fading. The mechanisms of tax collection, of law, of military recruitment, they just stopped working. The weight of famine, plague, economic strain, it hollowed out the institutions from within. A province might still be Roman in name, but if the emperor's official couldn't get there, couldn't collect taxes, couldn't enforce the law, then for all practical purposes, it was independent. The Germanic kings stepped in as the new source of order. Sometimes they even kept Roman laws and customs. So when we talk about 476, we're not marking a military defeat. We're noting the moment everyone finally acknowledged a reality that had been true for decades. The Western Roman Empire was no longer a functioning state. It was a collection of broken systems, shattered by a century of environmental stress it couldn't withstand. The Eastern Empire survived by adapting. The West, with its geography, its lost breadbasket, its deeper fractures, did not. Its end was less a dramatic fall, more like a weary sigh, the final admission that the world had grown too cold and too hungry for the old ways to continue. The 6th century's cold shadow fell beyond the Mediterranean. While Rome and Persia were struggling, another classical civilization was reaching its own turning point. Far to the east, the Gupta Empire in India, often called India's Golden Age, a time of powerful rulers, of art, of mathematics. But by the mid-6th century, that empire was also fragmenting. Its decline had many causes: internal politics, invasions from Central Asia. But now there's a question: could the same climate forces that strained the Mediterranean have reached India? Could a planetary event have touched this civilization in a different way? The Gupta system didn't rely on aqueducts or canals, it relied on the monsoon. That annual, life-giving rain, the entire agricultural cycle was tied to its arrival, to its strength. Farmers planted expecting it. The state collected taxes in grain after the harvest the monsoon made possible. It was a delicate reliance, a profound one. The late antique Little Ice Age, driven by volcanoes, didn't just cool the north, it disrupted global weather patterns. Climate models and some data from places like the Tibetan Plateau suggest a possibility that the same volcanic veils that cooled Europe may have interfered with the monsoon. The mechanism is complex, but the result is simple to grasp. Weaker monsoons, more erratic ones. For the Gupta world, a failed monsoon wasn't a bad harvest. It was a catastrophe. A series of them would be an existential crisis. Without reliable rain, the rice paddies and wheat fields of the Ganges plain would have faltered. The agricultural surplus that fed cities and supported the court would have shrunk. That would place immense strain on the empire's political structure, which was notably decentralized. Local lords, regional kings Samantas, they pledged loyalty to the Gupta emperor but ruled their own lands. Their loyalty was maintained by the emperor's power, by his military success, by the flow of wealth from the center. But what happens when the center can't provide that economic glue? When repeated droughts mean the emperor has less wealth to redistribute, fewer resources to reward lords or mount campaigns, the decentralized system, a source of strength in good times, could become a vulnerability. Ambitious regional rulers, facing hardship in their own lands and sensing weakness at the center, would be more likely to break away. To withhold taxes and troops, to declare independence, the empire wouldn't be toppled by a single invasion. It would be slowly pulled apart by its own powerful fragments, as environmental stress eroded the bonds that held it together. This is for now a hypothesis woven from climate science and historical detective work. The full story of the Gupta decline has many factors, but the timing is suggestive. The empire's fragmentation accelerates in the mid to late 6th century. In the wake of those same volcanic winters that reshaped the West, it hints that the tremors of the late antique Little Ice Age were felt across hemispheres. Not as a uniform cold, but as a cascade of localized disasters. Failed monsoons here, shortened growing seasons there, each one exploiting the unique vulnerabilities of the civilization it touched. Rome strained under its own logistical complexity. Persia saw its waterways falter, and in India, a golden age may have dimmed under an unforgiving sky. This parallel narrative changes the story. It's no longer just about the fall of Rome. It's about a planet-wide climatic shift that challenged the great classical empires from the Atlantic to the Ganges nearly all at once. Their shared struggle reveals something. The ancient world's greatest achievements and its most dramatic transformations were always a conversation with the climate. You can see it in the ground under these fields now. In Britain, in France, archaeologists find a kind of silence. Villages that were full of life in the 4th century, they're just gone by the 6th. No signs of a fight, no fire, just foundations empty and then the earth covering them over. These villages vanished, the landscape was emptying out. And that's one of the strongest pieces of evidence we have. It's not from a book, it's from the dirt, that rural abandonment. It means a population in retreat. When the climate got cold and the harvests kept failing, the isolated farm, the small village, it couldn't last. People had to go. They moved toward whatever felt safe, a walled town, a lord's estate, or they didn't make it. The countryside, once full of life, went still. In the cities, the story is in the stone and brick. Archaeologists see a process, they call it retrenchment. Great Roman cities built for huge populations, they started to shrink. The suburbs were left behind. The people pulled back, huddled behind a much smaller set of walls. Think of a city like Bordeaux in Gaul, or even Rome itself. The Aurelian walls, built earlier, they enclosed a huge area. but by the 5th and 6th centuries, people were living in just a fraction of that space. The rest became a wilderness inside the walls, fields and ruins right there in the city. This contraction, it's a physical sign, a society that couldn't keep up its own infrastructure anymore. The aqueducts that fed the outer districts, they were cut by siege or just neglect. The big public baths went quiet. The city didn't die. It retreated into a smaller, harder shell. Its horizons literally shrank. You can see the stress in how people buried their dead. Burial practices changed. In many places, the careful, individual graves from before, they give way to what's called crisis burials. These aren't mass graves from one event. They're communal pits used over time. They suggest a period where the normal rituals of burial were broken by the scale of the loss. There's also evidence of simpler graves, fewer goods placed inside. That could mean poverty, or a change in belief, or just a society that didn't have the resources or the time for a proper funeral anymore. How you treat the dead, it reflects the state of the living. Then there are the silent records, the kitchen trash, the granary. Scientists who study ancient seeds, archaeobotanists, they see a shift in layers from this time. Less evidence of delicate, high-yield grains like bread wheat, more barley, more millet, more rye, tougher crops that grow in poorer soil in shorter seasons. People were eating what would grow, not what they wanted, and the animal bones tell a similar story. The bones of cattle and pigs, they often get smaller. That suggests the livestock were poorly nourished, or people were raising animals that matured faster in bad conditions. In some places, there are more wild game bones in the trash. That hints that people were hunting more, going back to older ways to supplement their failing farms. This testimony from the earth is crucial. It backs up the frightened words from the chronicles, the chemical signals in the ice. It builds a case. When you see abandoned villages, shrunken cities, changed diets, different burials all across Western Europe, all in the same couple of centuries, that's not a coincidence. You're looking at the physical footprint of a deep change. These weren't political decisions. They were adaptations, often desperate ones, to a world that had turned colder and unpredictable. The archaeology shows a civilization not marching forward but contracting, simplifying, focusing purely on survival. It gives a shape to the crisis. It turns abstract climate data into empty hearths, into smaller city walls, a world that was changing fundamentally and quietly. The debate continues about how much that cold sky really weighed. How much the climate mattered. Some historians are cautious. They warn against environmental determinism, the idea that nature decides everything. They point to the clear failures inside these empires. The political corruption eating away at administrations, the endless wars between Rome and Persia draining both states, the social changes like powerful landowners undermining central authority. From this view, the empires were already fragmenting. Their systems were rigid. The climate was just a backdrop, some bad weather arriving as the structure was already starting to shake. But other scholars with modern paleoscience see it differently. They don't say the climate acted alone. They see it as a catalyst. Political corruption and military strain were chronic. They were the dry tinder. The volcanic winters and the century of cooling were the spark. A failed harvest forces impossible choices: feed the city or pay the army. Lower taxes and go bankrupt, or collect them and face revolt. The environmental pressure turned hard governance into catastrophic governance. It took those existing weaknesses and stretched them. A corrupt official during plenty is a nuisance. That same official during a famine, diverting grain, becomes an existential threat. The emerging model isn't simple cause and effect. It's about interaction. Think of an old bridge. Over time, some supports weaken. Maintenance lapses. That's the political and social decay. Then a historic storm hits. Rain and wind. That's the climatic shock. The storm didn't create the weakness, but it found every flaw. It stressed every cracked beam, every rusted joint. And the combination, the existing vulnerability plus the extraordinary stress, made collapse not just possible but probable. So the late antique Little Ice Age was a threat multiplier. It exposed frailties the empires had lived with in good times. It accelerated every crisis. A border raid becomes an invasion when the garrison is sick and hungry. A tax revolt becomes secession when the province is starving. The climate didn't dictate the story, but it shaped the plot. It raised the stakes for every human decision, every institutional failure. This view doesn't remove human agency. It puts it in context. It shows how the choices of emperors and generals were made in narrowing corridors under a sky that was closing in. The lesson might be about resilience, not whether a civilization is strong in its golden age, but whether it can adapt when the world grows cold, and that question of adaptation leads to the final legacy. The new world built in the long shadow it left behind. Paleoclimatology. It's the science of reading the planet's diary, and that diary is written in surprising places. In ice, in mud, in the rings of ancient trees, these are climate proxies, natural recorders that lock in signals of the past environment. To understand the 6th century, you need these tools. Take an ice core drilled from deep glaciers in Greenland or Antarctica. Each layer is a year's snowfall compacted over millennia, and in that ice are tiny bubbles of ancient air. A direct sample of the atmosphere from thousands of years ago, but the ice itself holds another secret. In the water molecules, not all water is the same. Some molecules are slightly heavier. They contain a heavier type of oxygen atom, oxygen 18. During warmer periods, more of this heavier water evaporates from the oceans. Eventually, it falls as snow. During colder periods, less evaporates. So scientists measure the ratio, the heavy oxygen to the light oxygen in each ice layer. That ratio is a thermometer. A lower ratio of the heavy oxygen means a colder year, a chemical signature of temperature written in frozen water. The thickness of the layers tells another part. A thick annual layer means heavy snowfall, a wetter period. A thin layer suggests a dry year, little precipitation. Combine these signals and you can reconstruct more than temperature. You see patterns of storms, of droughts. You see the sudden cold spikes of a volcanic winter, marked by a temperature drop, and often a layer of volcanic ash or sulfate chemicals trapped right there in the ice. Tree rings offer a parallel record. Each ring's width is a log of that year's growing conditions. A wide ring means a good year, warm with enough rain. A narrow ring or a series of them signals stress, cold, drought, or the dimmed sunlight after an eruption. By studying ancient timbers, from old buildings, from bogs, scientists build a year-by-year calendar of climate hardship, stretching back thousands of years. But how do we know these proxies are accurate? How do you calibrate a tree ring or an oxygen ratio to a specific temperature? This is where modern observation meets ancient data. Scientists study the relationship today. They measure current oxygen isotope ratios in precipitation and correlate them with known temperatures. They observe how trees grow under drought or cold. Then they apply those relationships backward in time. It's calibration and cross-checking. They also use multiple proxies from the same period. If ice cores from Greenland show a cold spike, and tree rings from Siberia show stunted growth, and a sediment core from a European lake shows changes in pollen types, all at the same time, that's a powerful convergence. It tells you the event was real, widespread, severe. These tools let climatologists run models to see how a massive eruption would have disrupted atmospheric circulation. The data isn't guesswork, it's a robust physical record, pieced together from archives all over the world, and it's this convergence that gives such confidence about the mid-6th century. The signal is too strong, too synchronized across too many different natural recorders. It can't be anything but a planetary scale event. Understanding these methods changes the story. It moves from a vague idea of bad weather to a specific, measurable phenomenon, a volcanic veil that cooled the globe, recorded in the chemistry of polar ice. And in the stunted growth of trees from Scandinavia to Mongolia. This is the backbone of the investigation, the hard data. It turns a historical mystery into a solvable puzzle, showing exactly how the sky became an actor in the drama of human civilization. The emperor's decision could save a city, or it could doom a dynasty. So much of this is about vast forces, volcanoes, climate, pathogens. But the final act that always belonged to people in power, their choices made under pressure, they determined how the crisis actually played out. And that raises a question: could different leadership have changed the outcome? Could a different response have softened the blow? The answer isn't simple. We see adaptation in the record, and we see profound misjudgment. Take Emperor Justinian in Constantinople, a figure of colossal ambition, ruling right in the heart of the crisis. His dream was to restore the Roman Empire, to reconquer the lost western provinces, and he launched massive campaigns to do it. He sent his general, Belisarius, to North Africa, to Italy, to Spain. This was the 530s and 40s, the very same years the dust veil brought famine, and then the plague arrived, so the empire is grappling with agricultural collapse, with a pandemic, and its leader chooses the most expensive endeavor possible: foreign wars of conquest. Logistically, it seems incomprehensible. It drained the treasury needed for famine relief. It stretched the army needed for defense, an army soon decimated by disease. Justinian's reconquests, they were initially successful, but they left the empire overextended, financially exhausted. Just as the climate and biological shocks hit their peak, that was a maladaptive response, prioritizing imperial prestige over immediate existential need. Now contrast that with Emperor Tiberius II. A few decades later, he faced a severe famine in Constantinople. Granaries were low, prices were soaring. Panic was spreading. Tiberius made a radical choice. He opened the state granaries, distributed grain freely. He sold off imperial plate and decorations to raise more funds for food. He criticized his own officials for hoarding wealth while people starved. This was a direct, adaptive response. It prioritized social stability, immediate human need over the long-term wealth of the treasury. A gamble on preserving the loyalty of the people, and by many accounts it worked. He was remembered fondly for it. These two examples show the spectrum. One leader doubled down on imperial glory at the worst possible time. Another sacrificed imperial treasure to feed his citizens. The lesson isn't about labeling leaders good or bad. It's about the quality of decision-making under extreme duress. The climate crisis didn't dictate a single path. It presented brutal, narrowing options. Invest in the army or invest in the people. Campaign for new territory or consolidate the core. Hoard resources for the state or distribute them to prevent revolt. The choices at these forks determined the resilience of the society. Justinian's choice may have weakened the empire's capacity to absorb the shocks. Tiberius's choice strengthened the social fabric at a critical moment. That humanizes the history. The environmental forces set the stage, they built the set, lowered the lights, but the specific choreography of collapse and survival was directed by human hands. Tax collection, grain distribution, military deployment, public health. These were the levers people pulled. Some pulls accelerated the decline, others slowed it. In the Eastern Empire, the shift to the theme system, granting land to soldiers, that was another adaptive policy. It acknowledged the new reality of scarce gold and the need for local defense. A creative solution to a problem the old system couldn't solve. So could different choices have changed the outcome? For specific regions, for certain cities, almost certainly yes. A different allocation of resources might have saved a province, fed a generation, held a frontier a while longer, but for the overall transformation of the Roman West, the scale of the environmental stress was so profound, so multi-generational, it's hard to imagine any suite of policies fully reversing the tide. The most resilient leadership might not have prevented change, but it could have guided a softer landing, managed the retreat with more grace, preserved more knowledge, more stability for the people living through the storm. The story is one of agency amidst immense constraint, a reminder that in the face of planetary shifts, our decisions still write the details of our destiny. And those details determine whether a legacy is remembered with gratitude or lost. Complexity was a shield, and it was also a trap. The Roman Empire, it had these vast cities, detailed tax rolls. It was a peak of human organization. They could build aqueducts, they could store grain for years, they could move legions across continents. But those strengths created deep vulnerabilities when the climate began to shift. To see why some societies shattered and others just bent, you have to look at how they survived day to day. The Roman model, it was centralized, it was specialized. It relied completely on fixed points. Its wealth came from intensive agriculture in the core provinces, Egypt, North Africa, Sicily. That grain fed enormous urban populations that didn't farm. They were administrators, soldiers, artisans, all of them dependent on that imported food. The state functioned by collecting taxes, often in grain or gold, from those fertile zones and then redistributing it. It was a system of magnificent efficiency in a stable world, but it had high fixed costs. It had low flexibility. When the late antique Little Ice Age shortened growing seasons up north, the whole system felt the strain. The distant breadbasket regions might still produce, but getting that surplus to where it was needed became a logistical nightmare as local failures multiplied. The empire was like a vast, intricate machine with thousands of interdependent parts. A shock to one gear could jam the entire mechanism. Now picture a nomadic confederation on the steppe frontier. Their wealth wasn't in cities or granaries, it was in herds, horses, sheep, goats. Their subsistence was mobile, it was diversified. If drought struck one pasture, they moved to another. Their diet included meat, milk, traded goods, not just a single grain crop. Their social structure was decentralized, built around kinship, loyalty to a chieftain. Not a distant emperor and a rigid tax bureaucracy. When the climate cooled and pastures shrank, these societies felt acute pressure. That pressure often catalyzed migration. It catalyzed conflict, but their fundamental strategy was adaptation through movement. They weren't tied to a specific plot of land, or a specific irrigation canal, or a specific warehouse full of tax grain. Their vulnerability was different. It wasn't about the collapse of a complex system. It was about being pushed into the territory of their neighbors. That set off chain reactions of displacement. This contrast explains the different outcomes across Eurasia. The highly complex, urbanized states Rome, Persia, maybe the Gupta, they experienced the climate shock as a systemic crisis. Their populations were dense and dependent, which made them susceptible to famine, to epidemic disease. Their governments needed steady revenue to function, and when agriculture faltered, that revenue vanished. Their response was often to double down on control, to debase currency, to demand more from a struggling populace, actions that could accelerate the very collapse they feared. Meanwhile, tribal or nomadic groups, while suffering hardship, they retained a crucial resilience through mobility, through diversification. They could absorb the shock by changing location. By mixing subsistence strategies, they didn't have a vast administrative apparatus to maintain. Their collapse, when it came, was more often a transformation. A splintering, a merger with another group, a long migration, rather than a bureaucratic dissolution. But we have to be careful not to romanticize simplicity. Complexity also brought powerful buffers. Roman engineering created water storage and irrigation that could weather a few dry years. The state granaries, the horia, were designed specifically for food security. The empire's networks allowed it to shift resources from a province with a surplus to one in deficit. These were extraordinary advantages that simpler societies lacked. The tragedy of the 6th century is that the climatic shocks were so severe, so prolonged, that they overwhelmed those engineered buffers. The advantages of complexity were negated, and the vulnerabilities were laid bare. This gives a lasting insight. The societies most vulnerable to climatic change aren't necessarily the weakest or the poorest. They are often the most specialized, the most optimized for a specific, stable environment. They build magnificent systems that work perfectly until the underlying conditions shift. Then their very sophistication can become a cage. Resilience seems to be less about sheer power and more about diversity, flexibility, the capacity to change course when the old maps no longer match the terrain. As the ancient climate crisis redefined continents, it was that capacity that determined who would fade into history and who would find a way to begin again. The old world didn't vanish, it broke apart, and from those pieces a new world was slowly put together. The long crisis of the 6th century, the cold, the hunger, the loss, it did more than weaken empires. It created the conditions for a different social order to emerge. The classical world, with its cities and its centralized states and its slave economies, was fading. And what grew in its place was the medieval world. The climate shock of that period, the late antique Little Ice Age, acted as a midwife to that birth. It accelerated trends that were already there. It made them irreversible. The first great shift was economic. The Roman economy had been built on slavery. Vast agricultural estates, latifundia, worked by enslaved populations, producing cash crops for urban markets. But that system required stability. It needed a steady supply of new captives from successful wars. It needed a functioning market to sell the surplus. The crises of the 6th century undermined both. Wars became more defensive, so fewer captives. The urban markets that consumed the surplus, they collapsed. Or they shrank dramatically, and then crucially, maintaining a large enslaved workforce during a famine became a liability. You had to feed people who weren't producing enough to justify their keep. In this new, poorer, more localized world, a different arrangement made more sense. The colonate, tying laborers to the land as tenants, giving them a plot to support themselves in exchange for rent and service to the landowner. This wasn't freedom, but it was different. It shifted responsibility for subsistence onto the worker, and it gave the lord a stable, tied labor force without the high maintenance cost of slavery. The climate crisis, by devastating the old commercial agriculture, helped break the slave economy. It encouraged this shift toward what would become serfdom. The foundation of the feudal relationship was being laid in those hungry centuries. The second shift was the movement of power and culture. As cities dimmed, new centers of authority emerged. One was the rural monastery. Isolated communities like those founded by Saint Benedict in Italy became beacons. They were economically self-sufficient, often in remote valleys. They preserved manuscripts, they maintained libraries, they offered a model of disciplined communal life. Their power grew because they provided something the state no longer could: stability, charity, a spiritual compass in a terrifying time. They became the new keepers of knowledge and of agricultural innovation. Another center of power was the local warlord, the man with a fortified hilltop and a band of armed followers. As imperial authority receded, people turned to these strongmen for protection from raiders, from the chaos itself. This personal bond of loyalty, service for protection, became the glue of the new political order. Power was no longer vertical, flowing down from an emperor. It was horizontal. a network of personal oaths between local lords and their followers. This was the raw material of feudalism. And on a broader scale, the crisis reshaped the religious and political map. The profound weakening of both the Roman and Persian empires created a power vacuum. A continental-scale vacuum. Into that vacuum stepped two institutions that would define the coming age. In the West, the Bishop of Rome, the papacy, filled the administrative void left by the vanished imperial government. Popes organized food distribution. They negotiated with invaders. They became the de facto political authority in Italy. Their moral authority soared as the last remaining universal institution. In the East, the exhausted stalemate between Rome and Persia left both empires vulnerable to a new, unifying force that exploded from the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century, the Islamic Caliphate. Some research suggests the climatic changes may have affected the arid peninsula, perhaps periods of drought influencing the social pressures that contributed to the rise of this new faith. And its rapid expansion into the weakened empires. So the late antique Little Ice Age was not merely an end. It was a chaotic genesis. It broke the rigid frameworks of the classical age. It made space for new political structures, new economic relationships, new cultural powers to take root. The contours of the next 1,000 years, the world of castles and cathedrals, of caliphs and popes, of knights and monks, those contours were being shaped in the cold shadow of those volcanic sunsets. The crisis forced a great simplification, and from that simpler, harder world, the medieval era was born. We've seen civilizations watch their world change before. The sky grew colder in late antiquity. That wasn't something people did. Now our world is warming, and it's tied directly to what we've built. The causes are different. One was the planet shifting on its own. The other comes from us, from industry. But the challenge at the center feels similar. How does a society, a connected system, adapt when the environment it was built for starts to change? The past isn't a blueprint, but it gives us a lens, a way to see what kinds of pressure build up and where things tend to break. Take resource scarcity. The Roman Empire hit a sudden shortage of its most vital resource, food. Their response was to debase currency, to hoard. Sometimes, like under Tiberius, they turned to radical redistribution. Today we're looking at potential shortages: water, stable land, coastlines. How we manage these under stress, through policy or technology or conflict, that will shape our stability. The ancient record suggests something. How a society distributes scarcity matters as much as the scarcity itself. Do leaders work for the common good or retreat into self-interest? That answer can decide whether a society holds together or comes apart. Then there's political cohesion. In late antiquity, trust in distant central governments eroded. Power flowed to local strongmen, to religious institutions. They could provide what the empire couldn't: immediate security, a sense of moral order. In our connected age, a similar erosion of trust in international bodies, in national governments, could fuel a turn toward nationalism, isolation, reliance on non-state actors. The lesson isn't that collapse is inevitable. It's that maintaining legitimate, effective governance during long environmental stress, that might be the ultimate test of a political system. It needs transparency, adaptability, a real commitment to the welfare of all citizens, not just a few. This history also speaks to resilience. The Eastern Roman Empire survived partly because it adapted. It reinvented its military and economic structures. The theme system was a response to a new reality. Our systems today are far more complex, but the principle holds. Building resilience means designing food systems that are diverse, decentralized enough to handle regional shocks. It means infrastructure that's robust and flexible, not just efficient under perfect conditions. It means fostering social networks, community bonds that can offer mutual aid when larger systems falter. Studying collapse isn't about fearing an end. It's about stress testing our own societies, asking where the vulnerabilities are and how we reinforce them before the pressure arrives. And this story challenges a modern assumption. We tend to see technology as a shield against nature. The Romans of the 6th century were the most technologically advanced society of their time. Aqueducts, roads, granaries. But those very systems created vulnerabilities when the climate shifted beyond what they were designed for. Our technology today is exponentially more powerful. But it also creates deeper dependencies, more catastrophic points of failure. The ancient world reminds us no amount of sophistication replaces wisdom. It reminds us of the humility to recognize we're part of an ecological system, not masters of it, and the courage to make difficult, long-term choices that prioritize resilience over short-term gain. So why care about ancient weather patterns? They're a mirror. They show us the dialogue non-negotiable between human civilization and the physical planet. They show that our greatest achievements are always, in some way, a negotiation with the climate, and they offer a sobering but ultimately hopeful insight. Collapse isn't a sudden event, it's a process of unraveling, often sped up by a failure to adapt, but adaptation is possible, reinvention is possible. The choices we make now in understanding these ancient pressures will write the next chapter in that long conversation. Rome didn't fall because of the weather. That's too simple. It misses the real story. We often look for one villain in history, one event that explains it all. But the past isn't that tidy. The climate shifts back then. They weren't a simple cause. They were a catalyst. They interacted with everything else. Think of it like a person with a heart condition. That's the empire's corruption, its overstretched borders, its social problems. Then they catch a severe flu. That's the volcanic winter, the crop failures, the plague. The flu doesn't create the heart condition, but it puts an incredible strain on a body that's already weak. The combination is what creates the crisis. The climate was that severe flu. It exposed every weakness. It accelerated every trend that was already happening. It turned bad situations into catastrophes, but it didn't act alone. You could point to the Justinianic plague and say, that's what finished it. Again, it's a powerful factor, but not a solitary one. The plague arrived in a world already reeling from famine, from economic shock. Its impact was multiplied because people were malnourished, because societies were stressed and on the move. The disease traveled along trade routes that were also breaking down. It's the interaction that matters. The plague in a healthy empire would have been a tragedy, but maybe not a transforming event. The plague in an empire whose foundations were already shaking from climate stress, that was a knockout blow. So you have to hold both ideas. The environment set the stage. It raised the stakes, then human decisions and institutions and pre-existing problems acted out the drama on that stage. Now there are more dramatic claims. You hear theories about comets or asteroids, even divine retribution. They're compelling stories. They offer a clean, spectacular explanation for the strange skies, the suffering in the old texts. But the strength of the modern view is its convergence. Multiple, independent lines of evidence all point to the same cause. The ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica show the sulfate layers of massive eruptions. The tree rings from across the whole northern hemisphere record the same years of stunted growth. The geological records from candidate volcanoes show eruptions of the right size at the right time. This isn't one clue, it's a whole constellation of clues all aligning. The scientific method builds a case that fits all the evidence. It doesn't pick the most dramatic story. A volcanic explanation fits the physical data, the historical descriptions of a dimmed sun, the timing of the agricultural collapse. It's elegant in its sufficiency. We don't need to invoke the extraordinary when the ordinary, a planet-scale volcanic event, is extraordinary enough. This nuanced view is actually more fascinating. It shows history as a web. A volcano erupts in the tropics. Its ash veil cools the planet. A farmer in Gaul watches his wheat turn black. A tax collector in Constantinople finds an empty granary. A soldier on the Danube goes unpaid. A chieftain on the steppe moves his people west looking for better pasture. Each event is a thread pulling on others. The collapse wasn't an event, it was a process, a slow motion unraveling across a century where environmental pressure kept narrowing the choices for kings and for commoners. Leaving with this model does something. It builds critical thinking. It makes us look at any major historical change and ask, what were the pressures? What were the vulnerabilities? How did they feed into each other? It moves us away from a childish search for blame toward an appreciation of complexity. The story of Rome's transformation isn't a warning that nature will destroy us. It's a lesson that our societies are embedded in the natural world. Our fortunes are tied to the climate, to the harvest, to the health of the land. The resilience of our systems is tested not in times of plenty, but when those fundamental supports begin to shift. That's the sophisticated understanding. The evidence-based one. It respects the power of the environment without surrendering human agency. It's a story not of fate, but of a fragile balance. And what happens when it's lost? The case is still open. We have evidence, but some of the most basic questions about this time still don't have final answers. The search goes on. Every new find can rewrite a piece of this ancient story. Take the volcanic trigger. We know there were multiple huge eruptions in the mid-6th century. The sulfate spikes in the ice are clear, but which volcanoes erupted and in what order? That's a fierce debate. Was it Ilopango around 539? Or some unknown volcano far to the north? The location matters. It changes how the dust veil spread, which hemisphere cooled first. Each new ice core, each layer of ash in a lake bed, gets us closer to mapping this planetary event. It's a global detective story written in ice and rock. Then there are the global connections. We've seen the cooling in Europe and the Near East, but what about the monsoon systems? The rains that fed other civilizations. Scientists are looking at stalagmites in Chinese caves now, sediment cores from the Arabian Sea, lake deposits in East Africa. These archives hold clues about rainfall. Did the volcanic veils disrupt the monsoons for the Gupta Empire in India? Could shifts in African weather have influenced migrations or set the stage for changes on the Arabian Peninsula before Islam's rise? Connecting these climate dots is a big focus now, trying to see the crisis not as regional, but as a global climate reorganization with local consequences everywhere. Maybe the most haunting unknown is the human cost of the plague. The chronicles are terrifying, but they're not census data. What was the actual death toll? A third of the population, half. Less modern science is tackling this with genetics. By pulling ancient DNA from plague-era burials, researchers can trace the Yersinia pestis bacterium itself. They study skeletons for signs of population stress, malnutrition, other illnesses. That made people vulnerable. Each new genetic sequence is another piece of a ghostly puzzle. It helps us see the scale of the catastrophe that reshaped the ancient world. This is the exciting part. History isn't a closed book, it's a living discipline. Every archaeological dig that finds a forgotten village from this period adds context. Every better climate model simulates how the dust veils moved. Every advance in genetic sequencing lets us ask new questions of old remains. Our picture of late antiquity is being redrawn with finer lines, more vivid colors. The story of the climate shifts that may have accelerated imperial collapse is unfinished. It invites us to watch the science evolve, to see history not as fixed facts but as a conversation. Between the present and the past, our tools keep getting better, our understanding keeps getting deeper, the past has secrets left to tell, and we are just learning how to listen. Leptis Magna is quiet, but it's not empty. You're looking at a Roman city on the Mediterranean coast, a theater, a marketplace, a basilica with pink granite columns. The scale is staggering, the engineering is breathtaking, but the story is in the sand. This was a wealthy city, a jewel of the empire in North Africa. It grew rich from grain and olive oil. By the 7th century, it was largely abandoned. The harbor silted up, the grand avenues were buried, the climate grew drier. The sands shifted, the lifeline that sustained the city, trade, agriculture, it slowly choked. Walking there, you touch the physical consequence of environmental change. The stones speak of human ambition. The encroaching desert whispers of a world that couldn't sustain that grandeur anymore. Then far to the north, in central Greenland, the story is written in ice. At the Ice Core project site, scientists drill down over 2 miles deep. What you see is blinding white, profound stillness, but the real journey is vertical. Each core they pull up is a time machine. A single meter of ice can hold centuries of snowfall. You can see the layers, thin bands of summer dust, clearer winter ice. And in those layers from the 6th century are the chemical fingerprints of catastrophe, a dark band of volcanic ash, tiny bubbles of ancient air sealed when Rome still stood. In that silent, frozen place, you stand on the data that tells us the sky changed. It makes the abstract real, then travel to the jungles of El Salvador. Near San Andres, archaeologists found a layer of white, a thick deposit of volcanic ash. They call it the Tierra Blanca Joven, the young white earth. This is fallout from the Ilopango eruption, a candidate for the great eruption of the mid-6th century. The ash layer is a stark line in the soil, a moment frozen. Beneath it, evidence of Mayan farming and settlement. Above it, a long period of abandonment. The local effect was apocalyptic. It blanketed the region. It likely contributed to a wider climate shock. To see that white line is to see a before and an after, etched into the earth. It connects a local disaster in Central America to cold summers in Europe, to famine in Constantinople. It's a tangible thread in a global story. These places are conversations. At Leptis Magna, it's a conversation between human architecture and an encroaching environment. In Greenland, it's between present-day science and a frozen past. In the Yucatan, between a thriving culture and a sudden, buried horizon. Visiting them changes the history. It turns events into a sensory experience. You feel the scale of the ruins, the cold of the ice, the weight of the ash. They remind us that the grand narrative's empire collapse. They're not just in books. They're in the ground we walk on, in the air trapped in ice, in the layers of the planet's own memory. To understand this past is to learn how to read these landscapes. To hear the stories they've held for centuries, waiting for us to listen. This doesn't have to be the end of it. If you want to go further, there are resources. Good books for Rome, for climate and disease and how it fell. There's Kyle Harper's book, The Fate of Rome. It's a masterful narrative. It ties it all together, and it's thrilling, but it's also deeply researched. Then for the long view, the whole relationship between humans and climate, you look at Brian Fagan. Books like The Little Ice Age, The Great Warming. He gives you that global context, lets you see the patterns over centuries. And if you want to see how climate change actually shapes civilizations, there's Jeffrey Parker's Global Crisis. It's about the 17th century, but it's a model, a brilliant model for thinking about environmental pressure on a grand scale. Or if you'd rather watch something, there are documentaries. From the big broadcasters, usually, they cover ancient mysteries, climate history. They'll have the scholars, the interviews, and these visual reconstructions of the past. For the science itself, the raw data, you can go to the research institutions, university websites. NOAA has a paleoclimatology data page. You can see the proxy data there. Ice cores, tree rings, you can look at the evidence yourself. Then there are the journals if you want to go that deep, the Holocene, quaternary science reviews. PNAS, they publish the new research, the breakthroughs in paleoclimatology and its historical impacts. Just reading the abstracts, you get a front row seat. You see the discoveries as they happen. This whole field, it's alive, it's evolving. Every new study is another piece of the puzzle. And when you seek this out, you're not just learning history. You're joining a conversation about this fundamental relationship between our societies and the sky, which is always changing. Your curiosity, that's what opens it up. A richer understanding of the world, how it was and how it's becoming. The sky changed, and that change wrote the last chapter of an age. We've gone from ice cores to old chronicles, and a picture comes together. The great empires of late antiquity, they didn't just fall by the sword. They were stressed, strained, and in the end, transformed by a changing climate. A series of volcanic winters, they brought famine and disease and migration in their wake. This isn't a story of simple cause and effect. It's a story of interaction. A web where environmental pressure met human vulnerability, and that accelerated a great transformation. It teaches a kind of humility. It reminds us that human civilizations, for all their grandeur, are embedded in natural systems. They aren't separate, they're conversations with the land, the water, the sky. The Roman and Persian empires reached heights of power that seemed unshakable. But their foundations rested on an unspoken agreement with a stable climate. When that agreement broke, the cracks in their societies widened into chasms. History never repeats exactly, but it often rhymes. The pressures of resource scarcity, of mass migration, of epidemic disease, these aren't relics, they're challenges we recognize. Understanding how past societies weathered environmental crises or succumbed to them, it gives us perspective. It shows that resilience isn't really about the strength of our walls. It's more about the flexibility of our systems, the capacity to adapt, to decentralize when you have to prioritize the welfare of the community during times of shared hardship. The climate has always been a silent player on the stage of human destiny, sometimes a supporting actor, sometimes, like in the 6th century, a lead. To see history through this lens is to see it more fully, to appreciate the courage of those who lived through the long cold and the ingenuity of those who built a new world from its aftermath.